Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yes, hello.
Today we're looking at something pretty interesting in India. You sent us some stuff about
The WAC Amendment Bill of 2024.
Yeah, sounds pretty
Yeah, it is. It's
intense.
quite a fascinating topic, to be honest, because it touches on so many different aspects of Indian society.
Yeah, so we've got some legal excerpts and an explainer doc about the WAC Amendment Bill. So we're going to try to look at both like the letter of the law, but also just the context of what this might mean for people in India.
Exactly. Yeah, and how this might reshape kind of the landscape of religious property rights.
Okay, so first things first, like what is WAF?
So WAF is essentially under Islamic law property that is permanently dedicated for religious or charitable purposes.
Okay.
So it's kind of like a trust in a way. But the unique thing about WAF is that the ownership is actually transferred to Allah. It's not transferred to like an organization or an individual or anything like that. And a mutawali or like a manager is appointed to administer this property and ensure that it's used according to, the dedication that was made.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So why is India like thinking about changing this now? Like what's prompting this bill?
So there have been, over the years, some growing concerns about inefficiencies within the existing WAC Act.
Right.
And this has led to calls for reform issues like mismanagement, lack of transparency, and really long processes within WAC boards.
Oh, okay.
So they're trying to modernize the system and make it more accountable.
Yeah, and even like the name change, it seems like kind of significant to me. Like
Yeah.
from WAC Act to Unified WAC Management, Empowerment, Efficiency, and Development Act.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think it does signal that shift, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about, like you said earlier, it's not just about tweaking the existing system, but it's about looking at it in a more holistic way
Right.
and trying to, improve management and really sort of develop these properties.
I think that's a really good point, and I think one of the big changes is like who can create a WAC?
Yes, definitely a major change. So the bill actually proposes that only Muslims practicing for at least 5 years, Andy, who own the property can actually declare it as WAF.
Okay. So that's kind of a departure from how it was before.
Yeah, it is. So previously, you could have situations where property was declared as WAF based solely on long-term religious use.
Mm-hmm.
And they're actually getting rid of that concept with this bill.
Okay, so there's probably going to be a lot of pushback to that from certain communities.
Yeah, potentially, because there could be challenges regarding existing WAF properties.
Right, yeah, so it seems like it could reduce future property disputes,
Yeah, that's the idea.
but it's also kind of opening a can of worms at the same time.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, so there's also this thing called Waqf al-Awlad.
Yes. Waqf al-Awlad, essentially an endowment made for one's descendants.
Oh,
So basically, you're setting aside this property for your kids, your grandkids, and so on, and then eventually it's dedicated to religious or charitable use.
so what's the bill's stance on that?
Well, the bill steps in here to ensure that this type of WAF doesn't actually impede women's inheritance rights.
Okay.
So it's a very significant move in terms of, trying to ensure greater gender equity.
Yeah, I mean, especially given the historical context in certain communities
Exactly.
of how women's inheritance rights have been treated.
Yeah.
Okay, and then there's that other thing that I found really interesting about government property.
Yeah, so this is where things could get really interesting.
Yeah.
Basically, the bill states that any government property that was wrongly declared as WAF will revert back to the government.
Mm.
So you can imagine things like historical mosques, shrines, even government buildings.
Yeah, that could be
This could be a very big.
a huge debate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we're seeing how this bill is kind of
Kind of balanced.
walking this tightrope
Yeah.
between trying to modernize this and also navigating all these historical claims and potential community tensions.
Yeah, it's a very complex.
Yeah. And it also changes the composition of like the Central WAF Council and the state WAC boards.
Yeah.
Like the very people who manage all this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Huge changes there.
Yeah, that's a big one. We should definitely talk about that in the next segment.
Absolutely. That's where the real debate starts.
Yeah, I feel like that's when things get really interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so let's talk about these changes to the WAF Council and boards.
Yeah. So one of the big changes there is the inclusion of non-Muslims
Oh, wow.
on both the Central WAF Council and state WAF boards.
Okay.
So you can imagine that this is a pretty controversial move.
Yeah, I was going to say, that seems like a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to look at, the arguments for and against it.
So what are those arguments?
So proponents of this change argue that, having non-Muslims on these boards could bring a more balanced perspective and maybe even reduce some of that mismanagement that we talked about earlier. They believe that, broader representation could lead to better management, more efficiency, more accountability.
So ultimately, it would benefit the community that it's supposed to be serving.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I mean, I can also see how some people would be totally against this.
Oh, absolutely. And, their argument is that this could lead to government overreach, right? Like,
Yeah.
is this a way for the government to kind of insert themselves into the Waqf system?
Right, almost like an infringement on the religious autonomy of the system.
Exactly. And they also worry that, decisions about these properties could be made by people who don't really understand or appreciate the religious significance.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's a very delicate balance.
Yeah, it seems like this more than any other part of the bill really brings up this tension between trying to modernize the system but also preserving the autonomy.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a tough one.
Okay, so what about the Waqf tribunals?
Yes. So the bill also proposes a change to the appeals process for Waqf tribunal decisions. So currently their rulings are final, but with this new bill, you could actually appeal to the High Court.
So before there was you couldn't challenge it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty big shift.
Yeah, so it sounds like they're trying to bring in more checks and balances to the system.
Exactly, making sure that things are, fair and transparent and accountable.
Yeah.
And another thing that they're proposing is a central portal and database for all WAF records.
Oh, wow. So everything's going to be like digitized?
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine right now they're managing almost 900,000 properties across India?
That's a lot.
With like outdated record keeping.
Oh my gosh.
It's a nightmare.
I bet.
So this would, bring it into the digital age.
Yeah. That seems like it's time.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and I guess like with all this money and stuff floating around, does the bill address like what happens if there are allegations of misuse or mismanagement of funds?
Yeah, for sure. So they are calling for like stricter accounting and auditing procedures. And, with that central portal that we talked about, Mutawalis would have to submit all their financial records. So it makes it much easier to kind of track.
Except for the boards to see what's going on.
Exactly.
So it's all about like closing those loopholes.
Yeah, tightening things up, reducing the potential for corruption or mismanagement.
So we've talked about how this bill will impact like property rights and religious freedom. But I think a big thing is how this is going to affect communities in India.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a big one, especially with the non-Muslim representation on the boards and the whole government property thing.
Right, because it seems like it could create more distrust.
Yeah, exactly. And, the bill is trying to do a lot of things at once, right? It's trying to balance all these different interests.
Yeah.
So it really depends on how it's implemented, and how people respond to these changes.
And, speaking of community responses, like the explainer doc you sent had some crazy examples of how, like, the current Waqf system can lead to all sorts of conflict.
Yeah, definitely. And one that comes to mind is the Surat Municipal Corporation building.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that one.
So basically, the WAF board claimed ownership of this building based on its use like centuries ago as a resting place for pilgrims during Hajj.
So just because it was used for a religious purpose a long time ago.
Yeah, and that's kind of the problem, right?
Yeah.
Like, where do you draw the line?
Right, like I feel like they could claim anything with that logic.
Yeah, pretty much. And, it raises this question of whether historical usage should supersede current ownership.
Right, yeah.
And there's another example, the islands in Betdwarka.
What happened there?
So the Waqf board tried to claim these islands, and it's predominantly Hindu area.
Okay.
So you can imagine that didn't go over very well.
Yeah. So it seems like these types of claims just create more tension.
Yeah, it creates this sense of like, are they just trying to take over, places that have no real historical connection to Waqf?
And there was that other case, the Shiv Shakti Society.
Yes, that one was interesting.
Yeah.
So you had this resident who registered his own apartment as Waqf.
Okay.
And basically turned it into a place for Muslim prayer. But he didn't get consent from his neighbors.
Oh, wow. So it was like in an apartment building?
Yeah, so it's really tricky, right? Because on the one hand, you have individual rights, but then you also have the rights of the community.
Right, and like the potential for it to disrupt the harmony of the entire community.
Exactly, yeah.
It's a tough one.
So, yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the legal stuff, but these are real people.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And real communities that are going to be affected by this.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to remember.
Right.
this isn't just like a theoretical debate.
Right.
These are changes that could impact people's lives,
Feels a
their
lot.
communities,
Yeah.
even the fabric of Indian society.
It's almost like a microcosm of India in a way.
Yeah, you could say that.
So it seems like the future of this bill really depends on so many things. Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
It's amazing to me how this bill is like forcing India to confront its past in a way.
Yeah, it really is. And I think what's so fascinating about this is that it's not just about, reforming laws or like legal technicalities.
Right.
It's really about like who India is.
Yeah.
Like how does it balance religion, history, individual rights? All of that stuff is coming up in this bill.
Yeah. So do you think that in trying to modernize this system, the bill risks like making things worse between different communities?
Well, I mean, it's definitely a risk, right?
Yeah.
I think on the one hand, the bill wants to make things more transparent and accountable.
Right.
But then you have these changes like having non-Muslims on the boards or letting the government take back property.
Right.
And that could really upset people.
Yeah. It feels like India's at this crossroads
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
where like progress and history are bumping up against each other.
Yeah, for sure.
So what do you think like long terms, what's going to happen with this?
I mean, I think it really depends on how they do it.
Right.
Like, if they implement this bill carefully and are really transparent about it and, like, actually try to talk to different communities, then maybe it could actually lead to a better system.
Yeah.
But if they just force it on people
Right.
and don't listen to concerns, then it could make everything worse.
Right. I think that's a good point. It
Mhm.
really emphasizes how like the law doesn't exist by itself.
Yeah.
Like it's always part of society.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot today.
We have.
We've gone through the main change, the history of the affection, the potential problems.
Uh-huh.
But now I think it's time for our listeners to like really think about this for themselves.
Yeah. What do you think about all of this?
Right. What parts of this really stood out to you?
Yeah. And what concerns you the most?
Right, because I think this deep dive is really just the beginning.
Yeah. It's a starting point.
Right. It's giving you the tools, but you have to use them.
Yeah. Like,
Sure.
what else are you going to read about this?
All right. Are you going to talk to people who have different views?
Yeah, because ultimately, the future of this bill depends on everyone being informed and engaged.
Right.
It's happening right now.
Yeah. So don't stop here.
Keep learning, keep questioning.
Yeah. And thanks for listening to this deep dive.
Yeah, we hope you enjoyed it.
And keep thinking about this important issue.